this. Oh, it automatically says this meeting is, it says it's live. Should I stop the recording? Well, try not to. Okay, let me, hold on. Okie dokie, attendees. There we go. We got Matt in. Ah, I see Tim. So let me, it says more. Okay, I got him here. Perfect. Okay, awesome. And now that I'm live, everyone can see us, right? Okay,
Yep.
Thanks, Jonathan. Bye.
All right, that worked.
Thanks to, I'm Veronica. This is Matt Wilson. We are the Guided Pathways coordinators right now. So I apologize. Our IT guys also, they're doing a retirement ceremony at the same time.
Yeah, no worries.
So we have a bunch. So there's people joining in right now. Welcome everybody. We'll get started shortly. We're waiting for everyone to come on and join in. So we'll begin in about 5 minutes.
Great.
And thank you for attending. We're excited. I'm excited. I'm a little starstruck right now that I have the honor to talk with you.
No need to be that, but I appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all. Is everything virtual still with you, or are you in person, or what?
Unfortunately, we're still virtual right now. We have a few classes that are in person, like a few nursing courses.
Yeah.
But the majority of our institution is virtual.
Okay.
So we are hopeful.
Yeah. All right.
That we'll be able to slowly, and just to give you a little background. So we started a series with Guided Pathways where we've been talking a lot about, we went through the history of Black Lives Matter. We talked, we have a huge Hispanic population as well. And we've gone through all of these different matters, but I felt like it was really important for us to finally come to this part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And to have an expertise as yourself to discuss this. So our administration and our folks are really passionate and really behind all of this. And I teach sociology. I teach a race and ethnicity course, and I use some of your videos for it. So that's how I found you.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So Matt, did you want to say anything as people are joining in?
No, I'm looking forward to definitely hearing Tim's perspective on continuing our discussion on equity and diversity from a different lens, and hopefully present some ideas and hopefully bring some enlightenment to all of our faculty members. As you hear different speakers, sometimes those stories or examples you can provide will definitely hit home with different people. So we're pleased to have Tim Wise join us here to hopefully allow us to reach out to all of our faculty to kind of really hit that mark home.
All right, and we have about 3 more minutes and people will continue to join. So we have this as a webinar, and Matt, once we get started, we can explain, people can ask questions. You and I will be controlling the questions and answers, and we'll get that towards the end.
What's our overall time frame? I knew this, but I've forgotten it. So remind me.
So we have 60 minutes for discussion and about 15 for questions and answers. Obviously, if you get done sooner, we can answer.
But about an hour and 15 total is what we're looking at. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Great. That works.
And as we're coming in, and I will introduce you officially in a few more minutes.
Okay.
I'm getting these all in. So is that a live bookcase behind you?
It's real, yeah.
Okay.
It's not live. I don't have the ability to actually animate and make my bookcase living, but it's real. It's not
yeah, one of our other individuals in our Donna Green, she has a bookcase full of books as well. And I'm like, did you really read all those? But hey.
Oh, I haven't read them all. I collect books, so it's just one of those things that happen to have a lot of, and it's good for research. I don't have to go to a library because I've got a lot, and it's good for my kids when they're writing papers in high school or college now. One of them, if they're home, they're like, "Hey, I'm writing a book. I'm going to write a paper on this. You got anything?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's right over there. Just go and
Awesome.
grab something off the shelf." Right.
That's incredible. Okay, we got about 1 more minute. More folks are joining. Welcome everybody as you begin to join in. Happy Friday, everyone. Our Friday before spring break. Woohoo! I'm excited. And Tim, I don't know where you're located at, but we have nice weather out here in the desert. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
I know the area where you are pretty well. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and today we actually have really good weather. Yesterday we thought we were going to get tornadoes, so it's better today by far.
I can comfortably say that we don't get tornadoes out here.
No, you don't, for sure. For sure.
Next week, 80-degree weather, perfect pool weather. So
yeah.
All righty. Give it a few more seconds. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming on in for Guided Pathways. We really appreciate you all attending here. First, Matt, can I have you introduce yourself? As you know, it's first time people are seeing you as the Guided Pathways coordinator. So go right ahead, Matt.
So everyone, I'm Matthew Wilson. I've been taking over the role of Guided Pathways faculty coordinator from Veronica over the semester. Prior to this, I have been teaching in the kinesiology department while developing a physical therapist assistant program, but I'm taking on the role in Guided Pathways over the next year or so. So if you guys do have any questions about projects, begin directing questions towards me, as that is my new role. I'm looking forward to working it.
Yes, thank you for that. And if you have questions towards me, please send them to Matt. No, I'm just kidding, just teasing, mostly. Well, it gives me a great honor and privilege. So today, Guided Pathways is proud to present and continue the conversation on race and equity in higher education. Our speaker, Tim Wise, is amongst the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states and over 1,500 college and high school campuses at hundreds of professional and academic conferences and to community groups across the country. Wise is the author of 9 books, including the latest, Dispatch from the Race Wars, City Lights books. Other books include Under the Affluence, Dear White America, Letters to a New Minority, and Colorblind, all from City Light Books as well. His highly acclaimed a memoir, White Like Me, which is reflections on race from a privileged son, recently updated and re-released, and Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White. Let's see. And we also have Speaking Treason Fluently, Anti-Racist Reflections from an Angry White Male, and Between Barack and a Hard Place, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama. Wise appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues and is also the host of a podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. So it gives me great privilege and pleasure to have you here, Tim Wise. So thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I hope everyone can hear me all right. I always start out these Zoom events with sort of the same disclaimer, because I've learned in the last year approximately that if I don't, I end up in all kinds of trouble. So let me start by saying I'm a 52-year-old man, and that means that I have virtually no technological skills to speak of. It means that any technology that is more recent than probably 1981 Atari video games is going to be way past my pay grade, and there's every possibility that I'm going to do something wrong. I'm going to hit a button. I'm going to knock my computer off of this thing that I've rigged to keep it at this height. I'm going to blow up the electrical grid on my entire block, knock out the internet for all of Nashville, Tennessee. Any of that or all of that could happen. I'm going to try very hard not to make that happen. I do have a 17-year-old in the house who's doing virtual learning, who's a junior in high school. I assume that she can bail me out if I screw up, but we'll see. In any event, it's a pleasure to be with you, even though it is this sort of virtual thing that we do nowadays, and to be able to talk with you about these really important subjects of race and racial equity, both in general and as it relates to higher ed. And I will try to relate it specifically to what it means for a community-facing institution like yours to really take on these issues of racial equity. But of course, to start with, I think it is worth noting the sort of timing and the importance of this conversation. I've been doing this work for a long time. I've been an anti-racism educator and or activist for 30 years. And I've been on the road lecturing and speaking to audiences much like this for the past 26. And at any point in that time, I think it would have been important, it would have been relevant. These issues, obviously, of racial injustice have plagued us as a country for hundreds of years. But right now, especially, we are in the middle of really the largest racial justice uprising in the history of the country since the killing of George Floyd last May, the killing of Breonna Taylor, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, of course, going back many years, finally leading to this uptick and a resurgence in the movement for Black lives. That, in addition, of course, to the movement for justice for immigrants and migrant workers and for families all across this country, brown and Black families being targeted both by law enforcement, by unequal educational institutions, unequal access to public health, unequal access to housing and jobs. And so we have Black and brown folks on the whole, not just within the movement for Black lives, but also the movement for immigrant justice and movement for healthcare access and affordability for all, who have been rising up in this last year and really going back several years, trying to challenge us as a country to figure out when we are going to turn the corner and move toward becoming a true multicultural, multiracial democracy. And although that has been a movement that has been afoot for a very long time, we are in this space right now as a country where we are especially intensely focused on it. Yes, in part because of the killing of George Floyd and the horrific video that we all saw of that killing last May and the uprising that took place afterward. But also, I think we're focused on it because of this thing we're doing, this virtual thing. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because we're still in the midst of this pandemic, right? This COVID crisis now going on more than a year, 545, almost 550,000 lives lost so far. The estimates are we'll probably hit 650 before we really see these numbers begin to stop their inexorable climb. And so with over 500,000 dead in the last year, we've all sort of been in this relatively very different and very, I guess, much more quiet space, right? A much quieter space than what we're used to. Most of us not going about our daily routines quite the same way, right? We're not going to work quite the same way. Most of us, some are, but most are not. Not going to class, obviously the same way. Not recreating, I hope, the same way that we were, although some people apparently didn't get the memo and they still are. But for the most part, right, we're sort of in a lockdown or semi-lockdown kind of culture right now for the better part of a year. And as a result of that, even though it stems from something horrific, as a result of that, there has been one odd and ironic benefit, right? And that is that being in that somewhat quieter space, we've actually had the ability to hear some things and to see some things that maybe we wouldn't have heard or seen before. We would have turned away from, right? Or put the noise canceling headphones of everyday life over our ears so we didn't have to hear about it. And we wouldn't have been able to feel maybe some of the things that we're feeling in this last year, right? Because when we're in that lockdown space, we don't have the normal routine going on, the normal noise, the background noise of our everyday lives, right? That sometimes makes it harder to focus. Right now, we're hyper focused on issues of racial justice because we can be, because of the relative quietude of the last 12 months. The challenge then, though, right? Because see, on the one hand, that's good. Like that's the one positive thing out of all this tragedy is that we're focused. The bad thing is, are we going to stay? It's not a bad, it's a question. It's not a bad thing necessarily unless we fail, right? But the question is, are we going to stay that focused when we get on the other side of this thing, right? Are we going to be able to remain as focused on the need to create racial justice once the COVID crisis passes, which is going to happen, hopefully sooner rather than later. But when it does, and we go back to our normal lives, right? And we go back to our recreating and going to class and going to work and doing the stuff we were doing before a year ago, are we suddenly going to go back to sleep? Are we going to hit the snooze button on that alarm clock that's been going off for 400 years and go back to bed? I don't expect Black and brown folks are going to. They don't have a lot of choice, right? Folks of color have to stay focused on this struggle. The question is really those of us who are white, so many millions of whom have come to consciousness in the last year, which is great on the one hand. Like it's fantastic that more white folks are asking these questions and talking about these subjects. But are we going to keep doing that in the same way and with the same intentionality when we've got other stuff going on that could very easily distract us? Are we going to stay focused when COVID passes? And are we going to be able to stay focused without constant reminders of awfulness like that videotape of George Floyd? We don't want to have to see stuff like that in order to be reminded and to understand we got an issue, right? We don't want these extreme iterations of depraved indifference to Black and brown life as daily or weekly or monthly reminders. It'd be great to never have another one of those. But if we don't have another one of those, does that mean racism's gone and we can all just sort of pack it up and stop talking about this? Or do we need to stay focused on the deeper systemic issues? Those are the things that concern me, because that video was the tip of the iceberg, right? And the disproportionate Black and Latinx and Indigenous death under COVID, where the death rates for Black and brown folks are 2.5 times, 3 times, 3.5 times higher than the rates for white folks. That disproportionality speaks to a deeper systemic truth, right? A deeper institutionalized, ingrained truth. It's not just about Officer Derek Chauvin and his depraved indifference to the life of George Floyd, or those cops in Louisville and their indifference to the lives of Breonna Taylor and whoever else could have been behind that door. They didn't know when they fired in that it was she and her boyfriend. Could have been, a whole family of people, could have been anybody. They didn't care. But it's not just them, right? It's the institution of law enforcement, the structure of law enforcement that we have to begin examining. With public health, it's the underlying structures of public health availability and affordability that we have to be examining, and a labor market that puts some people into riskier jobs, higher risk jobs when there's a public health emergency like a pandemic. These are deep structural problems. They're not going to be solved by a change in presidential administration, because all those problems were there before Donald Trump. They were there before Barack Obama. They were there before George W. Bush. They were there before Bill Clinton, right? And they're going to be there after Joe Biden and all through the course of this presidency. So we have to really think in much more systemic ways about how our institutions operate. And we have to realize that most of the work that has to get done is not going to make the news. And it's not going to be in the history books. It's not going to grab headlines. Going back to that iceberg analogy a second ago, it's very much like that, right? The iceberg, they always tell you like 10 or 15% of it's above the waterline, 85 to 90% is beneath. That's the same when it comes to racial injustice and inequity. A lot of it is beneath the line of consciousness and the waterline where we can see it and really observe it and know what's happening. And we have to begin excavating that. We have to begin thinking about those deeper issues, not just bouncing from one crisis moment to another crisis moment, and not just looking for that individual bad cop that we can hopefully prosecute and hold accountable for that depraved indifference to the life, in this case, of George Floyd. We have to think more capaciously than that, more systemically than that. So what I want to talk about today, obviously, I was asked to talk about, which speaks to this larger, deeper issue, is a subject that I know is very fraught for people, and I know it's very difficult for some folks, but it's an important piece of this conversation. I was asked specifically to examine issues of white privilege and power and how those things impact institutional inequalities. And I'm going to relate that, of course, specifically to education, but my comments really apply to larger institutional truths beyond the world of schooling. First, in order to talk about that, I do want to recognize and acknowledge the difficulty that some folks have leaning into this conversation and really being part of this conversation. And by the way, that goes for everyone. Black and brown folks don't really enjoy having conversations about white privilege and power with white people. They don't, because they know there's a really good chance they're going to get pushback, right? They're going to be accused of playing the race card or exaggerating the problem of racism, or contriving and sort of making up the issue of white privilege as some anti-white trope, right? And so people of color have learned to just sort of keep their head down and keep their mouths shut, particularly in institutional spaces where they don't predominate, particularly in institutional spaces where they're highly outnumbered when it comes to staff, or when it comes to administrators, or when it comes to faculty. Folks of color are very reticent oftentimes to engage these issues. White folks are reticent for a different reason, right? We're often hesitant to engage this conversation about white privilege, or even just whiteness at all. We don't mind talking about race like in the abstract sometimes, right? We don't mind talking about, I mean, some do, but nice white liberal people, for what they're worth, right, oftentimes don't have a problem talking about race as an issue for Black people, or as an issue for Latino folks, or as an issue for Indigenous people. Oh my God, it's terrible what happens to those people. But we don't really want to have a conversation about what that means for us, right? What does it mean that some folks are down, right? Well, down is relative to up every day, not because I said so, not because political philosophy or ideology says so, but basic grammar does. And so if certain people have been excluded from full opportunity, by definition, other people have been included, and more so than they otherwise would have been. You can't have a down without an up, right? But we use language in a way that mystifies that. Those of us who are white have used language like that for a long time. So we'll talk about the underprivileged, right? But there are two problems wrong. There are problems with that word. Number one is it's a passive word. Doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anybody. There's just privilege, and I'll be damned, there you are under it. And I don't have any idea how you got down there. It's fascinating. It's a mystery. I wonder what caused that. I don't know. Let's not talk about it, right? And the second problem is that the term underprivileged is relative. It's relative to what? Overprivileged. But that's not even a word, y'all. There's not even, that's not even in the dictionary, overprivileged. It's not even a thing, but it must be a thing. Because if there's an underprivileged, there must be an overprivileged. Who would that be? Shh, don't ask, because we don't really want to talk about it, right? We talk about the underserved communities, but if somebody's being underserved, somebody's being overserved. Who's that? Shh, we don't want to talk about it, right? Because then we have to examine our own role in the drama of race in this country. It's easy if we can keep it at arm's length, right? And make it about, oh, it affects those people and that's terrible. And oh my gosh, that Derek Chauvin, he's a horrible white guy and we don't want to be like that. Those boys in Charlottesville in August of 2017, those neo-Nazis marching around the campus at UVA, my God, that's terrible, right? But what this deeper conversation about race has to include is a recognition that we're all part of the drama. We're all in the mess, right? And that mess isn't just affecting Black and brown folks. It's not just, for instance, that Black and Latino and Latina students are 10 to 12 times more likely to attend a concentrated poverty high school than white kids. It's that white kids are 1/10 to 1/12 as likely to do so, right? That's the flip side of that. It's not just that African-American folks with a college degree are almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed. It's that whites with a degree are half as likely to be unemployed. It's not just that Latinx folks with a degree are 50% more likely to be unemployed. It's that white folks are considerably less likely to be, right? There's an upside to every downside. We don't want to talk about that because then we're on the hook, right? We're on the hook to do something about that. Even if we're not actively part of the problem, we're still receiving the upside of someone else's immiseration. And we don't want to discuss it because we don't want to feel bad. We don't want to feel guilty. This is not about guilt. None of this. It's about responsibility. There's a big difference between guilt and responsibility, right? Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Responsibility is what you take because of the kind of human being that you are. We take responsibility for things all the time that we're not directly to blame for, right? We do that as taxpayers when we pay for environmental cleanup that somebody else, created the mess. Like we didn't purposely, personally belch toxic waste into the air. At least I didn't. I hope you didn't, right? But we all know that as taxpayers, we got to take responsibility for what somebody did. Somebody's company, somebody's chemical plant, somebody's, whatever, right? We do that because it's beneficial to the whole. It's got nothing to do with guilt. It's got nothing to do with being a good or a bad person, right? Good people can be born into bad systems. Good people can find themselves parts of bad systems and structures. And unless you work to change those systems and structures, they will change you, right? And they will implicate you. So when we talk about white privilege, that's what we're talking about. It's not about calling white people bad. It's not about saying all white people live charmed lives of great wealth and power. My God, that's certainly not true. I grew up in an 850 square foot apartment from the time that I was 3 days old until the day I walked out the door to go to college. So I understand that not all white people are rich, not all white people are powerful, right? But white privilege is not just about money, right? Just like male privilege is not always about money. There are men that aren't wealthy, but on balance, it still pays to be a guy in a society of misogyny and sexism aimed at women, right? Those of us who are straight or cisgendered, we're not all rich and powerful, but we certainly have advantages relative to LGBTQ folks in terms of how we operate in this world and the opportunities that are extended to us. Those of us who are able-bodied, we have privilege and advantage relative to persons with disabilities. No one's going to deny that, right? Like if I said able-bodied folks have advantages, not one of you is going to be like, I don't know about that. I know some poor people that are able-bodied. They're able, I know some able-bodied folks live in Appalachia, so that can't be true, Tim. I know some able-bodied people that were raised in the hollers of Kentucky. So how can you say able-bodied people have privilege when able-bodied people are still poor? And I know somebody that's disabled and's got $1 million in the bank. So what are you talking about? That doesn't mean anything, right? You can't dispute a sociological reality with anecdote, with individual stories. You just can't. That's like saying, well, I know you say that smoking causes cancer, but my great aunt Polly, she's been smoking 3 packs a day for 50 years, doesn't even cough. So there, what do you have to say about that? Well, what I have to say about it is your aunt Polly's not a rebuttal, right? Your aunt Polly is not social science evidence. Your aunt Polly is an outlier, and God bless her, but that's got nothing to do with the larger sociological truth. And on balance, if you smoke 3 packs a day, you're going to die, right? It's like if you get shot in the head, you might live, but I don't recommend trying it just to test the hypothesis, right? There's sociological reality that we have to deal with. And the fact that some of us grew up without a whole lot of advantage doesn't change it. White privilege just means that those of us who are white have one less thing to worry about. That's all it means. But that's a lot, right? Having one less thing to sweat as I go about my daily routine. And then if you add to that like male privilege or straight privilege or cisgendered privilege or class privilege or able-bodied privilege, I mean, the more of it you got, the more opportunity you're going to have. But the point is, all of us have got some, right? Every one of us has got some kind of area, I guarantee you, where we're the dominant group. I've never met somebody who had nothing but marginalized identities, right? Because even if you're marginalized on the basis of race or gender, you might be able-bodied, you might be straight, you might be Christian in a Christian-dominated society. If you're a faculty member at a college, you've got a certain degree of professional privilege, certainly relative to the students that you have in your charge every day, right? We all have got some area where we're the quote-unquote norm. And whenever we're in that norm, in that dominant group, we have the luxury of being oblivious to some things that other people can't be oblivious to. That's the biggest privilege of all. And that's the one I want to talk about today. Not about material advantage and disadvantage. I want to talk about the privilege of being oblivious to other people's reality and your own, right? And the way that whiteness can sometimes do that for those of us who are white, just like being a guy can do that for those of us who are men, just like being able-bodied means I don't have to think about the stuff people with disabilities do. I know that I can get from one side of campus to the other, assuming, again, in-person learning, which at some point we're going to get back to. I don't have to worry about navigating the classroom space the same way or navigating the workspace if I'm on staff or if I'm an administrator or if I'm a faculty member, right? That's the privilege of being oblivious. It doesn't mean that as an able-bodied person, I'm a bad person for not thinking about that stuff, right? It doesn't mean that I'm intentionally oppressive to people with disabilities. It just means that I have the luxury of being stone cold ignorant to what other people are dealing with. And that makes me dangerous, right? Sometimes being oblivious doesn't matter. Like it depends, I guess, on what your career looks like. Like I'm oblivious to lots of things, y'all. Like I'm oblivious to calculus. All right. Let me explain why. I'm oblivious to calculus for one overriding reason. I never took it. And the reason I didn't take it is because the Metro Nashville public school system in which I was educated did not require it of me. And my feeling at the age of 16, 17, 18 years old was, if they're not going to make me take this, I sure as hell am not going to volunteer for the abuse. All right. That was my thinking, because even at 16 and 17, I knew that I was not a math guy. I'm glad some of y'all are. I hope some of y'all are. We need good people that know how to do that stuff, but I was not going to be that kid. So I basically constructed my whole academic career to never take calculus. As a result, if I were to get on this Zoom call and start trying to do calculus, like on a PowerPoint, and any of y'all had ever taken it, like, honestly, I could even try to do algebra and I'd screw it up. And you'd be like, hey, I do not think that he knows what he's talking about. Exactly. And the same thing applies with the subject I'm talking about today, privilege and whiteness, right? The reality is, if I were to try to do calculus, you'd know I'd never taken the class. That's the point. But unfortunately, in this country, those of us who are white sometimes will deny white privilege, will deny the reality of racism, even though we didn't take the class, so to speak, right? Metaphorically speaking. Men will act like sexism is not real, rape culture is not real, misogyny is not a thing, and we never had to take the class. Women took the class, women wrote the textbook, right? But we don't want to listen to them. Folks of color took the class, folks of color wrote the textbook. They had to know the truth. We don't listen to them. Right? Those of us who are straight or cisgender, we're like, transphobia, that's made up. right? But then trans folk who actually, taught the class, wrote the book, metaphorically speaking, have a very different reality. So part of privilege is just the privilege of being ignorant to other people's truth. And when you're ignorant to other people's truth, you're probably not going to figure it out on your own. I wouldn't be able to figure out calculus on my own unless somebody taught me, right? But that means I'd have to listen to the teacher. And in this country, a lot of times we don't do that. And white America has a long history of it. You can go back to the early 60s and you can look at polls that actually demonstrate, even then, before the Civil Rights Act was even on the books, right? At the height of the civil rights movement, 2 out of 3 white folks told pollsters that there wasn't really a problem. They said, oh yeah, black people are treated fully equally in America. White folks were saying that in 62 and in 63. The year of the March on Washington that Dr. King leads in DC, right? 2 out of 3 white folks are like, I really don't understand what they're angry about. Why are they marching? Like, everything's good, man. This is America. Everybody's got equal opportunity in America, right? Civil Rights Act hadn't even passed. Voting Rights Act hadn't passed. Fair Housing Act was 5 years away from being passed. And white folks are like, doop, doop, doop. I don't see anything wrong, right? What does that mean? Is that because those were mean, horrible, nasty, awful people? No. It's just that they didn't have to know any better. And if you don't have to know any better, you probably won't. And as I said, that's when you become dangerous. Because to not know someone else's reality means you cannot serve their needs, you cannot meet their needs. And this is important in the 21st century as we become a less white country and a more black and brown country and a more multicultural and pluralistic society. If we don't figure out how to meet the needs of everyone, including those who are an increasing share of our country, then we're doing them no favors, we're doing ourselves no favors, we're doing our society no favors. So if I'm oblivious to black and brown reality, because I can be, right? Is that helpful or hurtful? If I don't have to upgrade my skill set and I just keep teaching the way I've been teaching for 30 years, right? Because I got tenure, so I don't have to up my game. I don't have to figure out new methods and new techniques for reaching different kinds of students. I'm just going to do what I've always been doing. I had a professor like that in college. I had a guy, I was a poli-sci major, and I had a professor that waltzed into class the first week of this particular seminar, my freshman year of college. This would have been in 1987 when I was taking that class. He walks in with notes. We were doing a lesson on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had happened in 1962. So it was 25 years before. He walks into class with some notes that I swear to God, he wrote out in 1962. In the middle of that damn Cuban Missile Crisis. I could tell because they were like all yellowed and stained and like coffee spilled on it. And it just looked like some paper they don't even make anymore. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy wrote these notes 25 years ago. He's been teaching this damn class the same way because he can. He doesn't have to up his skills at all, right? You can be a literature professor teaching Shakespeare and not even be familiar with the multicultural critiques, feminist critiques of Shakespearean literature and still call yourself a Shakespeare scholar, apparently, but you're not. Like, you'd be a Shakespeare scholar, really good one in like 1717 or 1830, but not necessarily in 2021, right? As the community changes, the faculty, the staff, the administrators of a college have to change. As a community changes, the faculty, the staff, the administrators of a high school have to change. Employers have to change, right? But privilege says we don't have to. Privilege says y'all got to change and meet our structure. Y'all have to get different. Y'all are the ones with the deficit, meaning brown kids, meaning black kids, meaning low income kids, meaning non-English speaking kids. Y'all are the ones with the problem. And when y'all get your stuff together, you can come and be part of our institution, but we're not going to change for you. That's not how the world works. It is how privilege works, though, right? Because privilege says I don't have to change. I don't have to adapt. I don't have to view myself as an anachronism, right? I just get to keep on doing what I've been doing. And if 30% of the student body isn't following it and they're not vibing with it and they're not progressing in the same way, well, then that's their problem. That's not a recipe for success in a college. It's not a recipe for success in a high school or a school district. And it's not a recipe for long-term sustained multicultural democracy. So how do we really address this? What do we mean when we think about addressing privilege? Let's be very clear that the biggest privilege of all, which I think gets in the way of creating equal educational opportunity, is the faulty sense that is ingrained in all of us from the very beginning of our childhood, frankly. And it's one that those of us who are white have a particular ability to believe. Black and brown folks are not as sold on it because they can see where it falls short. But those of us who are white have had the luxury, or one might say the privilege for a very long time, of believing that wherever you end up is all about your own effort, right? This notion of meritocracy, this notion of rugged individualism, right? This idea that wherever you end up is all about your own effort. Now, this has been an American ideology for a long time, right? Sort of the cornerstone of American ideology, in fact. Like if America were a Bible, that would sort of be Genesis 1:1, right? Wherever you end up is all about your own effort. Anybody can make it in America. Let's keep in mind, though, a few things. Number one, we said that even during segregation, right? We did. I mean, that was a thing that we said even when the law said not everybody could make it. Even when the law was very clear, no, you ain't making it. No, you're not going to live here. You're not going to go to school here. You're not going to have these jobs. You can't even eat at that lunch counter, but anybody can make it in America. We said that. We fully embodied that contradiction and didn't even think of it as a problem. We had that myth at a time when women weren't even allowed to vote, right? We had that myth at a time when Black folks were still held in bondage. We've had that myth all along, going back to the so-called frontier, right? This idea that, you know, with determination and grit, America's a place where anybody can succeed. What does it say about us that we said that even at a time when our laws made it very clear we didn't mean it? Well, what it says to me is that it's more of an ideology than a reality. It's more of a mythology that serves a psychological need than it is a description of actual sociological truth. But here's the thing, if you're told that and you come to believe it, what will happen as you look out and you see inequality? Think about it. If you're told wherever people end up is all about them, and then you see vast inequality, all right, where you see white folks disproportionately on the top of the hierarchies, not exclusively, but disproportionately, and you see Black and brown beneath those on the hierarchy, or you see men disproportionately on the top of the hierarchy and women disproportionately on the end of the hierarchy on the bottom, or you just see rich folks of whatever color up here at the top and poor and working class folks down here, you start to rationalize the inequality, right? Because you were told wherever you end up is all about you. So if you believe that, if you don't think to challenge that, and historically, white Americans haven't, that's just it. Historically, those of us who were white had the luxury of believing it because our story sort of looked like that, right? Every generation of white folks sort of were better off than their fathers and their grandfathers and their mothers and their grandmothers. There was that upward mobility for most white folks. For Black and brown folks, they could never take that for granted, because people of color always knew they'd been doing some of the hardest work and it didn't necessarily get them anywhere. But if you were white, you could really buy into that. The problem is, if I buy into that and then I see certain people struggling, I'm going to blame them for struggling, right? I'm going to blame working class folks and poor folks for their economic condition. I'm going to blame Black and brown folks if they're not succeeding in school at the same level, or if they're being disproportionately carted off to jail or prison. I'm going to make assumptions that there's something wrong with them, because after all, everything in my culture told me that wherever you end up is all about you. And once I've done that, I'll never actually try and change anything. I'll never actually try and fix the system. Why would I, right? Why would I try to fix a system that I've now normalized, right? So the problem is the privilege of being oblivious to other people's reality, including the reality that meritocracy isn't real and that rugged individualism has never been enough. If I'm oblivious to that truth, which is a Black and brown truth and has always been a Black and brown truth, if I'm oblivious to that, then I don't try to fix any of the inequities. That makes me dangerous, because the institutional space that I embody and that I inhabit can no longer meet the needs of this increasingly Black and brown community, right? That makes me less effective as an educator if I'm a college faculty member. Makes me less effective as an administrator. I'm now not meeting the needs of my constituents, right? I'm not meeting the needs of the community that my community-facing institution is sworn to represent and to meet, which means that I'm failing at my job. By definition, right? I can't serve the community that existed 30 years ago if the community's different. I can't serve the community that existed 50 years ago if the community's different. And even the most elite institutions in America have started to figure this out, like Phillips Exeter, which is this very fancy prep school in New Hampshire, right? They, many years ago, started to realize there just weren't going to be enough rich, white, East Coast Protestant families to keep their ass afloat, right? They started to realize, like, we're going to have to expand the definition of what it means to be what they call an Exonian. That's what they call themselves when they come through that place, right? They now have like 35, 40% of the students are students of color. And that's because they've made a very, and they still got issues, don't get me wrong, but they've made a very deliberate effort to diversify that institution for that reason. And they're not necessarily doing it for racial justice reasons. Let's be clear. I'm not going to give them that kind of credit, right? They're not necessarily doing it for the right reason. They're doing it for institutional integrity and longevity. They'd like to be around 100 years from now. And in order to do that, they have to meet a very different community where it is. And a lot of times our institutions are slow to make that transition. We just get stuck in our ways and we think we can just keep doing things the same way we've been doing them. But as a result of that, we end up failing the community as the community and the face of the community changes. So we have to be aware of the way that our obliviousness to other people's truth makes it really hard to serve their needs, right? And we don't serve their needs, we're not doing our job, right? Which is a knock on us. That's part of privilege, right? The ability to not really have to think about that. Another aspect of privilege is to not have to think about the way that inequality was structured very deliberately in education in particular. And if we're going to create equitable educational institutions, not just in college, but really going all the way back to kindergarten, we have to start with a more accurate understanding of how we came to this place, right? Because it's not just that rugged individualism is oversold or that meritocracy is oversold. Let's be very clear. Unequal education was the purpose of education in America. And I know that may sound hyperbolic, it may sound radical, it's not hard to prove. Let me restate it. The purpose of education in this country from the beginning was to perpetuate inequality. A lot of times we say things like education is the great equalizer, but the only way you could believe that is if you studied no history. Right? Because education has never been that. That was never its purpose. It's not just that like that was its purpose, but we haven't quite figured it out, or that was its purpose, but we just need better funding or better training or some more money. And no. The purpose of school was inequality. Here's how I can prove that to you. Let's go back and start with Thomas Jefferson, right? Who was not just a founding father and eventually president, but also, of course, was an educational philosopher of his time. He was somebody very well regarded as an educational theorist in the new nation. He, of course, was a founder of the University of Virginia. And Thomas Jefferson had a lot of things to say about what school should look like in this new nation. One of the things he said was, well, here's what we need. He said this in his writing notes on the state of Virginia. He said, what we need is about 5 or 6 years of compulsory schooling. Now, he didn't mean that for everybody, right? He didn't mean it for Black folks. He didn't mean it for indigenous peoples. He didn't even mean it for white girls and women. He was just talking about white boys and men, right? He's like 5 or 6 years mandatory education. Why did he want that? Well, he said why. He said we need 5 or 6 years of compulsory education so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. His words, not mine, his words. So what Thomas Jefferson was saying is most of y'all are trash. And remember, I'm just talking about the other white folks now. Right? I'm not even talking about, don't even want to know what I think about Black folks. I own hundreds of them. So you know what I think of them. You don't want to know what I think about Native people, right? You don't want to know what I think about even the girls and the women that look, white like me. I'm just talking about white guys. Most of the white guys are garbage. Just another synonym for rubbish, right? But if we give y'all 5 or 6 years of school, we can figure out which ones of y'all are smart enough to come with us and run stuff. And then the rest of y'all can just like do all the really difficult labor, right? Other than the labor that enslaved people are doing, which is the really, really difficult labor. But you'll be like one level above that, right? So Thomas Jefferson was saying the point of school is to help us perpetuate inequality. And that was just within the white group, right? To say nothing of white versus non-white. Then fast forward 100 some odd years later, a little over 100 years later, Woodrow Wilson, who would also become president. But before that, he was the president of Princeton. And he too was a well-regarded educational philosopher, educational thinker, someone people turn to for insights on what schooling ought to look like in America at the turn of the 20th century. And what did Woodrow Wilson say? He said something very similar to Jefferson. He said, well, here's what we need. We need one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. It didn't mean liberal like liberal versus conservative. That was just the word for college education back then. We need one group of people, he said, to prepare themselves for that, to prepare themselves for college. And then he went on to say, we need another group, a larger group, he said, by necessity in this and every other society, to forego the privilege of a liberal or college education and instead prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks, right? In other words, he was saying the same thing Jefferson was saying. He's saying, look, the point of school, y'all, and again, just like Jefferson, he was just talking about white people. Wilson was a vicious racist. He had no intention of educating black folks in college and brown folks in college. He probably wasn't thinking that much about white women. He's just saying we need just a handful of white folks, to get this college education, and the rest of y'all are going to lift things, right? The rest of y'all are going to sweat. We're going to be special and elevated and exalted. We're going to be the masters of the universe. We're going to run everything. And the rest of y'all are going to work for us. So there you have Thomas Jefferson and Woodrow Wilson, both saying the purpose of education is inequality, right? Not equality, inequality, not as an accident, not coincidental, but as a design flaw, right? This is not a bug in the app. This is not a glitch. It is a feature of the app. Fast forward to the early 2000s, because I know some people might say, yeah, that was a long time ago. That's like early 1900s. And, Jefferson was writing in like the 1780s. So that was a really long time ago. Okay, fine. Fast forward to 2001 or maybe early 2002, but like 20 years ago. And George W. Bush has become president. And the biggest law that was passed in his first term was the No Child Left Behind educational reform package, right? And without getting into all kinds of details, this big educational reform, it had a lot of people that were for it, a lot of people that were against it, and there are a lot of political conversation about it at the time. One Sunday after that law became a law, I remember watching one of the political talk shows, and I'm watching the show, and they had William Bennett on, who was the former Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. And they're asking him, as a former Secretary of Education, what he thinks about that law and generally sort of what is his take on education in America. And the question they asked him that day that was so interesting was, they said, Mr. Secretary, tell us, what do you think the biggest problem in American education is today, right? And that's like a really weighty question, right? It's the kind of question that if someone asked you that on national television, I suspect you might want to take a sip of water. You might want to give it some thought. You might want to stall for time. You might ask to go to commercial for 2 minutes. Like I would. It's a big question. I would hate to screw that up, right? But Bill Bennett, he didn't need a gulp of water. He didn't need a second to collect his thoughts. He surely did not need a commercial break. He was ready. And he knew what the answer was. And remember the question, Mr. Secretary, what's the biggest problem facing American education today? And William Bennett says, without missing a beat, that the biggest problem is too many people are going to college. And I remember thinking, well, now who is he talking about? Right? Because he didn't say, he didn't say. But I'm trying to figure it out in my head, and they didn't ask. See, they should have followed up that question with another, who's going that ought not be going? But they didn't, and he didn't volunteer the information. But let's just sort of work it over, you and me, right? Let's think about, who do you think he's talking about? Let's start by figuring out who he's not talking about. Because if his argument is too many people are going to college that ought not be, do we know who he doesn't mean? I do. I don't think he means the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents who are working on like 5 generations of mediocrity. I've known some really mediocre ass rich people, y'all, and you probably have too. Right? People who are incredibly mediocre, like those guys that wrecked Wall Street a decade ago and damn near destroyed the global economy. Like they got a lot of money. They all went to really good schools. They probably had really high SAT scores, and they damn near destroyed the global economy. So I've known a lot of mediocre people who happen to have a lot of money in the bank. And my guess is when Bill Bennett says too many people are going to college, he doesn't mean them. He's not talking about going to those prep schools like Phillips Exeter, the one that I mentioned, and going into the head of school's office and sitting them down and saying, hey, you know what, bring me all the C students. I need to talk to them, and all the students who were just barely scraping by. Cause that they have like mediocre students at prep schools, right? Like there's the valedictorian that graduates first, but I mean, somebody graduated last, right? I mean, that had to happen. Somebody was just the worst student at that prep school. And I don't think anybody's going into that head of school's office, sitting them down and going, hey, I know you want to go to business school, or maybe take over your daddy's company, or go to law school, or be a doctor or something. But I mean, I think you just need to forget all that. You like barely graduated from high school. Why don't you just think of a career in fast food? Why don't you just do that? Nobody does that. Nobody goes into the places where the powerful people are educated and says you ought not go to college because you're not college material. And Bill Bennett didn't mean them. When he talks about the people who were going who shouldn't be, he is talking about working class people, and especially those of color, because those are the folks who would be going now who previously in other generations wouldn't have been. Right? So he doesn't have to say it. It's the only logical conclusion. It's the mentality of the slave master, isn't it? Because what did the slave owner say, right? He's, well, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? Right? How are they going to pick cotton if they learn to read? See, in the modern version of that is, well, if they all go to college, who's going to pick this fruit in the fields? Right? They all go to college, who's going to change the bedpans at the hospitals? They all go to college, who's going to change the sheets at the hotels? Right? Because we have a labor market that is predicated on inequality. Therefore, we end up with a school system that feeds that labor market. You don't want everybody going to college. So when Bill Bennett says that, he's talking about working class folks. He's talking about folks of color. He's talking about first generation college students. He's talking about the kind of students that go to your institution. And he's talking about the kind of institutions that educate the folks that go to that institution. A lot of first generation students, a lot of working class folks, and a disproportionate number of brown folks. He's basically saying that institutions like yours don't even need to exist, right? Because they're educating the wrong people. What does that mean? What does it mean that Thomas Jefferson in the 1780s and Woodrow Wilson at the turn of the 20th century and Bill Bennett at the turn of the 21st all told you the very same thing? The point of this thing we call schooling is inequality. Is to keep certain people on top and to hell with the rest of y'all. That's the thing, right? And if you understand that, then you start to understand how this system of inequality came to be. And now you can start to imagine how we might unwind it. But the problem is we have the luxury or the privilege of believing that this inequality just came about naturally, right? Well, some people just worked harder, I guess. And, you know, some people just really busted their ass and played by the rules and worked really hard. Most everybody works hard. In a competitive economy, you sort of have to or you drown, right? You don't have much choice, but some of our hard work is met with access to an opportunity structure and others of our hard work is not, right? And so we don't have the luxury of hiding behind that myth of meritocracy and individualism. We have to understand how these structures function and begin to recognize that some people have had a 5-lap head start in an 8-lap race. And according to the Bill Bennetts and the Thomas Jeffersons and the Woodrow Wilsons of the world, that's as it should be. And we should just keep letting them win. But if I've had a 5-lap head start in an 8-lap race, I should cross the tape first. I should hit the finish line first. Doesn't mean I'm actually the faster runner. If I've had more opportunity to accumulate professional credentials in academia or as a staff or administrator at a college or university or in any private sector job in America, I should have a better looking resume. It doesn't mean that I'm a better scholar or a better HR director or a better whatever it is that I am. It just means that I had more access to opportunity. So how do we move away from a system that perpetuates that injustice, that perpetuates unearned advantage and unmerited disadvantage, and create a system that actually functions for the benefit of all? Well, first, we have to be willing to rethink the criteria that we use, whether that's for hiring or whether that's for admissions to colleges, especially for those colleges that have selective admissions processes, but even just for hiring, for the hiring of faculty, for the hiring of staff, for the hiring of administrators. I've been doing work with a bunch of private companies in the last year, the way that the criteria that they use to determine who's qualified for certain positions. Where were those criteria imagined first? Where did they develop? They developed in a system where certain people had access to those and other people did not. And if you use that criteria unthinkingly and uncritically, and you don't interrogate the outcomes of that, you'll perpetuate inequality. We know, for example, that about half the new jobs in the economy since 2010 have been filled through networking, and specifically by way of people who work for an institution, helping other people get jobs with that institution by writing letters of recommendation, letting a friend know or a neighbor know or a family member know. Well, is that really about merit or is that about connection? And who does that leave out? Who are the people less likely to be in those networks? Well, they're less likely to be folks of color. They're less likely to be working class of any color, and they're less likely to be women of any race or economic background. So racism and sexism and class disparity all ends up being perpetuated by some of the normative ways that we hire for jobs, right? If we're talking about faculty positions and we're thinking about who has the ability to have this job as opposed to this job, or staff positions or administrative positions, and we're just looking at a resume, we say, well, this person's got 6 years of experience and this person's only got 2, or this person's got 12 and this person's only got 8, or this person, has gotten all these references and recommendations and presented at all these conferences and done all this amazing field work or lab work or written all these books. But if we're not thinking critically about what went into accumulating those credentials, it's like looking at the race at the very end, like that last lap, right? And being really impressed by the person that hits the tape first. My God, they're a good runner, right? Without looking at any of the stuff that was on the track, right? The fact that certain people were running with ankle weights, the fact that other people were having to jump over hurdles, right? And so unless we're looking at the whole process whereby people accumulate credentials, 2 things are happening. Number one, we're missing an awful lot of amazing people and we're doing an injustice to them, but we're also not getting the best people for our institutions, right? If I'm taking the runner who happens to hit the tape first, but that person had a 5-lap head start, that may not be the fastest runner. You don't want that person for the track team, right? You want the person that maybe started out 5 laps behind, but at the end was only down by 3. Right? Because if I start out 5 laps behind, at the end of the race, I'm down by 3. I'm the faster runner. You ought to hire me for your track team. You ought to recruit me for your track team. Same is true in the workplace, right? We have to be looking at credentials relative to where people started to actually get a sense of what their effort is and what their talents are, right? And what their ambition is and what their capacities are. And we have to be willing to rethink all those criteria in the name of a mission that is community facing, especially in community colleges and institutions whose purpose, whose mission, whose reason for being is to serve an ever-changing community. Privilege tells us we don't have to do that, but common sense tells us that we do. And the institutional integrity of our spaces where we try to educate people tells us that we must. We have to look at education as a revolutionary act, taking a system that was constructed for the purpose of inequality and deciding that we're going to do something different with it. But we'll never do that if we don't understand where it came from and if we don't understand the things that keep that in place. Unless we look at our jobs as educators and administrators at a college or university in the 21st century as being to fundamentally alter those dynamics in society that have been created, then we're just going to be perpetuating them. There's no middle ground, right? You're either undoing systems of inequality that were put in place or you're perpetuating them. There's no sort of neutral middle space where you can say, oh, well, I'm not going to make it worse, but I'm not going to make it better. Because if you're not working to make it better, you're just perpetuating the movement of the train in the forward direction that it's always been headed in, right? And so we have to be prepared to have that kind of conversation as educators. We have to be prepared to say that to be competent and to be qualified as an educator in the 21st century is to develop a different skill set than would have been needed in the 20th. Certainly a different skill set than would have been needed in the 19th. This is not true just at a college. It's true for high school teachers. It's true for middle school principals. It's probably true for kindergarten teachers, right? I mean, the reality is that the skills that we all have to develop in the America of 2021 are vastly different than the skills that would have been needed 20 and 30 years ago. It might have been helpful to have them even 20 and 30 years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, but now they're absolute necessities. Right? And asking those who are the most marginalized to make all the adaptation, right? To adapt to the existing criteria and the existing standards takes for granted that those existing criteria and standards are the ones that serve everyone best, when that may or may not be true. The reality is both sides of that equation have to bend. The dominant culture has to bend to a new social norm. And those who have been marginalized obviously have to be prepared and equipped to succeed in a culture that they still do not control and that is controlled mostly by others. But that's a multi-directional street, right? It's not a one-way street of assimilation. It's multiple forms of assimilation. It's marginalized folks and quote unquote minoritized folks assimilating to a dominant norm, but the dominant norm assimilating to a new multicultural reality so that we can create a new synthesis from the combination of those things, right? And so part of relinquishing privilege is relinquishing the comfort that comes with doing things the way that we've always done them. and starting to rethink how we might change our curriculum, how we might change our outreach and recruitment, how we might change our programming, how we might upgrade our own skills so as to reach a vastly different student demographic than perhaps would have been in existence 20 and 30 and 40 years ago at the same college or in the same community. How do we connect to the community and make sure that the community understands all of the opportunities, both educational and professional, that exist at the college or university? How do we make sure the community knows that this space is really for them? You see, again, privilege maybe doesn't have to do that for people in the dominant group, because people in the dominant group have always sort of taken for granted. That's part of privilege, right? Taking for granted that wherever I am, I belong there, right? So if I know people who have gone to the college, if I know people who've worked at the college, and I know there's a job opening, I'll apply for that opening. Or if I know that, oh yeah, college down the road, I'll go to school there, maybe take a couple classes there. If I've known people who've done that, and if I feel, like that space sort of belongs to me, I won't think twice about it. But there'll be other people who maybe won't assume that, especially at the professional level. They might go as students, but when it comes to trying to get jobs or trying to work there in some professional capacity, they may not see that as for them, right? So part of this is thinking about, how do we take the mission of the institution and filter it down to every level of what we do? And if we're not going to do that, why even have a mission? Why have a vision? Why have any kind of a value statement at all? Why don't we just say, well, we're just here to help people prepare for careers and, teach them a trade and send them on their way? But it's not really what a college does. I mean, it might be part of what a college does, but a bigger part of what a college or university does in this country, whether it's a 2-year school, a 4-year school, a state institution, or a private institution, is preparing people for the world into which they're going to be deposited. And the world into which students are going to be deposited in 2021 is just a very different one from that of their parents and that of their grandparents. And we have an obligation to meet people where they are. That means being aware of all the things that we've taken for granted. That means not only understanding Black and brown perspectives, but understanding how our own perspective as white folks has been shaped by our whiteness, how our identity has affected us, because we all have a lens and none of our lenses are perfect. Right? All of our lenses sort of show us only what they show us. And a lot of what they show us is a function of what we've been exposed to. And it's certainly not the fault of most white folks that they haven't been exposed to a broader, more multicultural reality in most cases. But if that is the case, whether it's our fault or not, we have an obligation to think how we're going to do better, to be better at our jobs, to meet the needs of everyone. If you had any other job in the world, if you were making tennis shoes for Nike, and you came up with a design and nobody bought that shoe, or some people bought it, but it really bombed with like half the population. Eventually the executives are going to call you in at Nike and be like, you just need to maybe rethink this thing. And it's not going to do for you to say, well, that is one hell of a shoe design. I know what I'm doing. I'm competent. I worked really hard on that shoe design. And if they don't get it, it's their fault. That's not going to work. But in this country, sometimes we do that as educators. We act like, well, if these kids aren't getting it and they're not doing as well in middle school or high school, these young adults in college, they're not, they're dropping out at a higher rate. They're not graduating, and say that's on them. Really? Is it? Because it might be on us. It might be in part that we're not adapting to the needs and meeting the needs of people. That may be a skill deficit that we have, not just a skill deficit that they have. So we have to start thinking in those broader terms. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of that with you and to, sort of plant some of those seeds with you. Obviously, these are long conversations that take a lot more than an hour for us to, process and get through. But I just want to leave it at that, open it up to questions. We'll do that for 15 or 20 minutes and I'll let you get on your way. I do appreciate y'all having me out, even if it is just virtually, and hopefully at some point be able to get out there in person and have some longer conversations with you. But again, thank you for having me, and look forward to the questions that you'll have, which I think are going to be moderated so I don't have to touch anything or figure out my own chat function, which I certainly cannot do. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time, and we really appreciate that. We are allowing this time we do have some questions, but we are allowing this time for you all to ask some questions and or ask to speak, and we can do that as well. So the first question was actually mentioned during your presentation. Yeah. It stated, hello, Tim. When you say that faculty at a college has to change, do you mean the race needs to reflect the body of students they are teaching, or do you mean they have to adapt their ways of teaching to reach more racial diverse students?
Well, the latter of those is the primary thing, but I think the first of those can sometimes also help facilitate the second. Meaning, I think that it is important that the professional makeup of an institution, like a college, better reflects the community that it's trying to serve. It's never going to be perfect, but it needs to be better for sure. And so if there is a substantial gap, as I know there is, because I've seen the numbers for your school, between the students being served and the folks who are in certain, especially tenure and tenure track positions and top administrative positions and that kind of thing, then that is a cause for concern. It doesn't mean that those white faculty can't teach anymore. It doesn't mean that they all need to be given, severance and told to enjoy retirement. It doesn't mean that they have to be summarily dismissed and replaced. And it doesn't mean that they can't do a good job. I've certainly known plenty of white scholars and white faculty who do an excellent job reaching students from a number of different backgrounds. But I do think the research certainly suggests, and it starts well before college, that having teachers, faculty, administrators, staff, authority figures who reflect the demographic of the community being served does create a sense of trust and a sense of connection and a sense of ownership over the space, which we know does help facilitate better outcomes for marginalized group members. It's just a fact. And so to not do better in that regard is to say that we're more concerned about the professional stability and the professional continuity of white folks than we are the educational needs of Black and brown folks, right? Which is a problem. I mean, that should be the primary concern, is what works for the community, because that's who the college serves. Having said that, the primary thing should be to remember that the goal is the outcome for all students. And that means that white scholars who are down for that mission, white scholars who are on board with the idea of reaching all in an equitable fashion and meeting the needs of the entire community, are absolutely and should be seen as at a premium for being brought into that institution. They are not only welcome, they are desired. On the other hand, those scholars, whether they are white or of color, who are not really committed to that work or who don't do a good job of it, are not being helpful. There are scholars of color who do not meet the needs of all students. There are administrators and staff of color who are not down for that mission. It's really more about what is your intentionality vis-a-vis the mission than simply the melanin levels in the skin or one's cultural or ethnic or racial background. Although there's a correlation between those backgrounds and the likelihood that you'll be down for the mission, right? My guess is, yeah, on balance, there are probably going to be more Black and brown folks who are committed to a mission of racial equity per capita than there are white folks. There are probably going to be more women who are down for an anti-sexist mission in an organization than there would be men. Not because all men are vicious misogynists, right? Just like not all white folks are vicious racists. It's just that on balance, the marginalized group members think about that stuff more. So if you lead with that, you probably will end up with more of them in positions of authority, which is great. But the message should be very clear that we want not just folks of color in this institution as faculty and staff and administrators. We want a different kind of white person in this institution too, right? We want a white person that's as down for racial justice and as committed to that as anybody else, because that person is going to be an asset. But a white person who clings to the idea that we don't have to deal with this, or a white person that says, that's not my job, I teach biology, right? Or a white person that says, well, I'm a math teacher. Why do I have to care if I reach everybody? I just put equations on the board, right? Or I just do this, that, or the other. Or I work in facilities and I don't have to worry about this. This isn't really my job. That's anachronistic in 2021. That's a person who is qualified for the job 50 years ago. They are profoundly unqualified for the job today. And I have no compunction about suggesting that, right? To be qualified in this day and age in the community as it exists is to have to up one's game. And white folks are certainly capable of doing it. The question is, are we committed to doing it? Some are and lots aren't.
Thank you for that. Just quickly, this recording will be available. And so once it gets all done, we'll send it out campus wide, okay? Another question is, and Matt, you might have to help me because my screen's moving. Let me move it up here, sorry. What is the first step to begin to meet the underserved needs?
So I think the first thing is to remember, first of all, going back to the language thing that I talked about earlier, that if someone's being underserved, it's really marginalized. It's not a passive thing, right? So if we're thinking of people just as underserved, which is the terminology we use, we got to be more specific and remember that that lack of service has been an active process. People have been denied service, right? It's not just that they didn't get it. They were denied it by someone or something or a combination of things. So number one is just making sure we're always keeping that in mind. The second thing is to reflect on one's own role in either the perpetuation of that underservice or marginalization on the one hand, or in remedying it. And that means getting really clear on one's own racialized lens. You have to understand your own lens if you're going to help anybody else, right? And I think sometimes we skip that step, right? Because we think, okay, I'm an educator, and nobody goes into education. Like none of y'all on this call, nobody goes into that field to make a lot of money, to have power, right? To get pats on the back, because educators are horribly devalued, whether you're teaching kindergarten or college, right? We know that. But sometimes when we're in those kinds of professional spaces, and I think the same is true for doctors and nurses and social workers and therapists, people that are in like the helping professions, of which education would be considered one, I guess. There's a tendency to assume that because I have good intentions, right, that I'm part of the solution, I'm not part of the problem. But you can actually be both. And so I think part of really meeting the needs of people that have been marginalized is to understand how little you sometimes know about them, right? And how little you really know about their experience. And the only way that you can improve that situation is to learn to really listen and create space for them to share their experiences and to get out into the community and go to the places where you can learn directly from others. Not talk, but listen, right? Not teach, but learn. Understand, think of education as an educator, thinking of it as a two-way street or a multi-directional highway, as opposed to, I'm standing at the front of the classroom and I'm teaching the lesson. Well, you do have some, if you're an educator, you have some content knowledge that you can share with students, and that's your job, and that's great. But the people who are the students also have incredible wisdom that they can share with you. And the community has a reserve of wisdom that is oftentimes not valued sufficiently. And I think of this not just with regard to schooling, but just in regard to elitist thinking in general. I remember, when I lived in New Orleans for 10 years in the 80s and 90s, and I was a community organizer for a period in public housing communities in New Orleans. And at that time, those were almost all Black and certainly all poor. And I remember when I would tell people what I did, right? And I was working in those communities trying to work with community leaders to, get certain laws passed or to block other laws from being passed or to somehow get resources into the neighborhoods. And I would tell people what I did, and the communities where I was working, they always had this advice, unsolicited advice for me to take back to them. These were people they didn't know, in neighborhoods they never visited, in communities they had no idea anything about them, but they thought they knew something about them. And they would tell me, well, we just need to get some of those corporate executives to go into the public housing projects and teach those folks how to manage money. And I remember thinking, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. You want rich people to tell poor people how to manage money? What the hell are you talking about? Rich people don't know how to manage money. They hire people to do that for them, so they don't have to. That's the whole point of being rich. You don't balance your own damn checkbook if you're really rich. If you're balancing your own checkbook, that proves to me that you ain't rich, right? So having a corporate executive go in and teach people, come on. But these poor women that I'm working with every day in that neighborhood, who somehow managed to survive on $350 a month at the time, right, in combined public benefits, and then maybe they're working under the table for cash, trying to work a couple jobs, hustle here and there just to put food on the table. That takes talent. Why don't we send them in to the houses of rich people and tell them how to get by with less? Why don't we have them go up to Tulane University, where I went to school, and tell all these spoiled little kids who come down there from up north how to survive without mommy and daddy's allowance that they keep getting every week, right? That actually takes skill. But see, that requires flipping our deficit model and assuming, because we assume the deficit is on the marginalized or the underserved, whichever term we use, rather than understanding actually those are folks with an amazing reservoir of talents and skills, surviving and thriving and managing to make it against all the odds and all the obstacles in their way. So I think part of the first part of being able to serve people is to recognize one's own blind spots and to recognize all the things that you don't know, and then integrate that new understanding into the way that you interact with people.
Thank you. We also have another question. What are the best ways to improve the lens and sharpen our ability to think beyond our privilege?
Well, I mean, the best way to do it, obviously, is to listen to marginalized voices and to hear what they have to say to us. So much of what I know about race and racism, for instance, I would never know if I had been left to my own devices. I'm a relatively smart guy, and I got all these books behind me. We were joking before we got on actual event. I hadn't read all these, and I definitely did not write all of them. I've read a lot of them. But you know what? Even if I had read every single one, even if I had read every single one of these books and all the other ones I got on a Kindle somewhere, the fact of the matter is that I would only have sort of an academic understanding of these issues. The reason that I really understand this is because I had mentors of color in the city of New Orleans, mostly Black folks, who sit me down and told me what was going on. And I'd learned to listen to them and to respect their wisdom. It was those women I worked with in public housing who, here I am, I'm walking in there with my college degree and I'm ready to help. And they're just like, that's very much appreciated. Maybe you need to sit down and listen for a little while, right? And so these women who had like 10th grade education, some of them high school diplomas, but almost none of them had been in college. And yet they knew more about the way the economy functions, the way the job market functions, the way the housing market functions, the way policing operates in this country than I did. And I paid good money, or at least, taxpayers did, because I got lots of loans. So thanks for that. But somebody paid a lot of money for me to have all that education. And these folks, knew it a lot better than I did. Well, I learned to listen to them. Why? Because my mom taught me to listen. I went to preschool at a historically Black college where most of my authority figures were Black women who I learned to respect when I was 3 years old. So luckily I had that experience, but most white people have never been subordinated to Black or brown authority. Most white people have never actually been in a situation where we had to really listen to people of color, and not just listen, but just shut up and believe that they know what they're talking about. And so part of it is making sure that we create opportunities, maybe on a campus, for the students, but not just the students of color, also faculty and staff of color and community members of color, to come in and talk about the realities of the community. That's what a great thing for a community college to do. I don't ever expect some elitist institution to do that, because they're elitist institutions. They don't even pretend to be about the community, but y'all are this community facing organization and institution. What a great opportunity to bring the community in and to say, hey, why don't talk about how we're meeting your needs, how we're not meeting your needs. What could we be doing better? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing really ugly? And how can we change that? Actually seeking insight from people in the community would be a revolutionary thing to do, because we don't do that very often. We just sort of assume, well, our doors are open and anybody's welcome to come through. But, not everybody's going to kick that door down unless they actually think that you really want to listen to what they have to say. And so I think creating opportunities for that is the best way to expand your lens. And more importantly, just to realize how distorted that lens often is prior to that kind of experience.
Thank you for that. It looks like we don't have any more questions, because there was an extra one, but you answered it within your first one of your other questions. So again, we got a lot of comments that were thanking you for coming to speak with us. And we really appreciate the discussion on inequality and white privilege. It was super informative. So we really appreciate your time. And I can't thank you more than enough, because we've been doing a lot of work at our campus. We just, like you mentioned when you first started, I don't like, I was born and raised first generation student. I don't like talking about white privilege, and some people get offensive. So I appreciate you coming here and talking about this. And our chat's just going off with thank yous. So thank you for your time. And again, we will make this, this recording, we will send it out. So, because we know a few people couldn't make it. So thank you very much for that.
Sure.
Matt,
well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Everybody stay safe, and hopefully I'll get to see you in person at some point.
Yes, come to the desert, not in the summer.
No, I'm not coming in the summer. I'm not. No.
Thank you so much.
Well,
have a good one. Bye now. Stop the recording. All right, y'all. Have everyone enjoy your spring break.